I was 11 years old the first time I saw someone shunned. Her name was Miriam. She was 24. She had been married 3 years and had 2 small children, and she sat in the third row from the front every other Sunday at church, same as always, in her plain blue dress with her covering pinned straight. And then one Sunday, she was not there. And the week after that, she was not there. And when I asked my mother where Miriam was, my mother looked at me with a particular expression, not angry, not sad, something more careful than either. And she said very quietly that Miriam had made a choice. She did not explain what the choice was. She did not need to. Even at 11, I understood what the absence of a person in a small community meant when it was accompanied by that particular silence. Miriam had done something that the community could not stand behind, and now Miriam was gone, in the way that people go when the community closes around their absence like water closing over a stone. I did not ask again. I filed it away instead, the way children file away things they are not ready to understand yet, in a place where it waited until I was old enough to open it. My name is Hannah. I grew up in a strict Old Order community in Ohio, and the 3 things I am about to tell you tonight are the 3 things that could end a woman's life inside that community completely. Not end her life in the dramatic sense. End the life she had always known. End the warmth. End the belonging. End every relationship she had ever built, replaced by a silence so complete it had its own weight, its own texture, its own particular smell of absence. I know these 3 things because I spent 22 years learning them, because I watched what happened to the women who crossed them, because I came, at different points in my own life, dangerously close to each of them. Let me tell you the first one. The air in our church on a baptism Sunday had a particular quality to it, thick with expectation, warm with bodies pressed close together in the farmhouse where service was held. The smell of wool and soap and the particular mustiness of old hymnals passed from hand to hand for generations. I had sat through dozens of baptism Sundays before the one that mattered, before the Sunday when I watched a girl named Susanna, 20 years old, quiet, with a stillness about her that I had always mistaken for peace, stand up when the bishop called her name, and then, in the silence that was supposed to be filled with her yes, say nothing. She stood there for a long time. The bishop asked again. The congregation waited. And Susanna stood in that warm, wool and soap-scented air and said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but that carried to every corner of the room because the silence around it was so complete, I am not ready. 3 words. I am not ready. They fell into that room like stones into still water. The first rule is this. You do not refuse baptism after you have committed to it. Not technically, not according to any written rule, because the Ordnung acknowledged that baptism was a free choice. But in practice, in the lived reality of our community, publicly hesitating at the baptism moment after months of instruction was understood as something close to rejection. It said, I have been standing here with you, learning with you, preparing with you, and now at the last moment I am pulling back. It said, I am not sure, and in a community built on certainty, not sure was close to dangerous. Susanna was not formally shunned that day. She was too young, not yet baptized. The Meidung did not technically apply. But what happened was in some ways worse than formal shunning. It was a social withdrawal so complete and so consistent that it amounted to the same thing. The warmth left. The invitations stopped. The conversations became careful and brief. She existed in the community as a person who had failed a test that everyone else had passed, and that failure followed her in every interaction for the 2 years she remained before she left for good. The smell of that morning, wool and soap and the cold air coming under the farmhouse door, is something I can still call up instantly, along with the sound of Susanna's voice. I am not ready. I thought about those words for years. I still think about them. The courage it took to say them in that room. The cost of saying them. whether the courage and the cost added up to something worth it. I think they did. But I watched Susanna pay the price for 2 years before I was sure. The second thing is harder to explain because it is less visible than the others. It lives in a category that the Ordnung addresses directly and that the bishop referenced at least twice a year in Sunday preaching. The category of Hochmut. Pride. Specifically the kind of pride that involves elevating yourself above the community. Distinguishing yourself. Making yourself visible in a way that draws attention to you as an individual rather than to the community as a whole. In practice, this meant that a woman who developed what the community perceived as an outsized sense of her own opinion, who pushed back too consistently, who expressed disagreement too openly, who had ideas that she pursued with what felt like individual ambition rather than communal service, was walking a line that could, if she crossed it definitively, result in a formal process of correction. A conversation with the deacons, a meeting with the bishop, a period of increased accountability that was not quite shunning but was close enough to it that the difference was mostly technical. I knew a woman named Lydia who crossed that line. She was 31. She had been married 8 years and had 4 children, and she was, by any measure, one of the most capable people in our district. She organized things. She saw problems before they became problems and solved them before anyone else had identified them. In a different world, she would have been exactly the person you wanted running things. In our world, she was becoming a problem. The specific moment I remember was at a community gathering where a decision was being made about the upcoming harvest cooperation. The men were discussing the schedule. Lydia, who had been running the coordination of her family's contribution to this cooperation for 6 years, and who understood its logistics better than anyone in the room, offered a specific correction to the plan that would have prevented a significant inefficiency. She offered it clearly and directly and without apology. The room went quiet in a particular way. Not because she was wrong, because she had spoken with authority that was not hers to have, in a space where that authority was not sanctioned, in a manner that did not soften itself into suggestion or question, but came out as simple, confident correction. The bishop spoke to her husband the following week. Lydia adjusted. She learned to offer her corrections as questions, to soften the confidence, to make her knowledge available without making her authority visible. She was good at it, actually. She was good at most things, and the community found its equilibrium again. But I watched her learn to hide the sharpest edges of herself, and I felt something in me respond to it that I did not want to feel. A kind of recognition, a kind of grief. The third thing is the one that ended Miriam, the one I learned about at 11 years old from my mother's careful expression and her 2-word answer, made a choice. It took me years to find out what Miriam's choice had been. I pieced it together in fragments, a comment here, a silence there, the way certain things were spoken around rather than about. What I eventually understood was that Miriam had formed a friendship, a genuine, sustained, private friendship, with a woman from the outside. Not romantic, not transgressive in the way the outside world might imagine. Simply a friendship, a connection that lived outside the community's boundaries, and that Miriam had chosen to maintain rather than end when the community became aware of it. That was the choice. Maintaining a relationship that existed outside the walls, choosing a private connection over the community's definition of where her connections were allowed to exist. The Meidung in Miriam's case was swift and complete. She was baptized. The Ordnung was clear. The bishop was thorough. And Miriam, who had sat in the 3rd row from the front every other Sunday, disappeared from that row and from our community, and from the first 11 years of my life as completely as if she had never been there. I found out where Miriam was, eventually. She was living 40 minutes away. She had rebuilt a life, slowly, with the particular difficulty of someone who left everything they knew in their mid-20s with 2 small children. I did not contact her. The community I was still living in at the time did not permit it, but I knew where she was. And I held that knowledge quietly, in the place where I held all the things I was not ready to open yet. These three things, refusing the expected yes, claiming authority you were not sanctioned to have, maintaining connections that crossed the boundary, were the fences that ran around a woman's life in our community. Not the only fences, but the most electric ones. The ones that, if you touched them, changed everything immediately and completely and without appeal. I came close to each of them at different points. I will not tell you tonight which ones I touched and which ones I managed to step back from. That is a longer story. What I will tell you is that learning where the fences were, really learning, not just abstractly knowing, changed the way I moved through my own life, made me more careful in some ways, more deliberate in others, and eventually, honestly, more angry. Not at the people. I have said this before and I mean it. Not at the bishop or the deacons or the community or my mother or anyone who enforced these rules. They believed in what they were doing. The belief was real. But the fences themselves, the specific location of them, the way they ran most consistently along the edges of what women were allowed to be, those I am still angry about. Quietly, consistently, in the way of something that does not go away because it is true. I want to ask you something tonight. Are there fences in your life that you have accepted as natural, as simply the way things are, that were actually built by someone else, for reasons that made sense to them, around the specific territory of what you are allowed to be? Because I think most of us have them. I think most of us learned where they were so early that we stopped seeing them as fences. We started seeing them as ground. You are allowed to look down. You are allowed to see the fence. You are allowed to ask who built it and why and whether it still belongs where it is. That is what I want to leave you with tonight. Look down. See the fence. Ask the question. You are allowed.